This video is about macros. Macros are used everywhere. They can be thought of as global variables that hold information saved in one part of a process for use in another part. A small number of operators can create and modify macros, whereas a larger number of operators can use or have their operation modified by a macro. A good understanding of all of this is vital to get the most out of RapidMiner, and this video gives some worked examples to show some basic operations. So we'll cover the process context, the macro view, then we'll look at some operators that create and change macros, a small list, then we'll look at the loop operators, these modify macros typically, and then finally we'll look at using macros to modify how operators work. Just some typical examples, by no means all, but hopefully enough to give you a flavour. So I have a process here. I've made a view here just to make life a little easier when we show everything working. I'm just going to move this over to the right so it all fits. Here we go. So this process simply retrieves the RS data set. That's not really the point. That's an example set. These operators here, these are the well-known generate macro type operators. There is actually a video for these, so I won't go into any detail of these, but these just illustrate how you can create a macro, and these operators are then how you can do something with that macro to record it for posterity. This operator here is a loop attributes operator. I haven't covered this in any of my videos, so we'll go into a little bit of detail. And these commented out operators are other loop operators that will, I won't run them, but I will go through them one by one. The point about these operators is that they all modify the value of a macro as they execute, so you can know where you are. Then these operators are using macros. This isn't a full list of all possible usages of macros, but hopefully it's enough to give you a flavour. So, but before we start, let's look at the process context first. The process context, here it is. You get it view, show view, context, and here we are. Here it is. This context contains repository locations to feed into the process, repository locations to record the results, but also there's a macros section here, and I've created 3 macros. You add new ones by pressing this button here. Basically, I have 3: context, macro, something. So hello world is sort of the obvious one. My role, I'm going to use this later. These are examples of strings, and here's the one that's an example of a number, context macro delay. And you also notice there's a macros view. Again, you do that view, show view, macros, there it is. And as macros get created or actually deleted, they will show up or not, as the case may be, in this window here. And you can see, sure enough, the context has correctly set the macros, and their results are showing up here. So the first thing is going to be this generate macro command. So let me just type here macros. This is going to give you a full list of all operators which are primarily to do with creation of macros or modification of them. So there are really 2 important ones. So the first is generate macro. There is actually a video about this, and I'm using it here. There's also set macro and set macros. Those are, I think, subsets really of generate macro. In general, use generate macro. I suspect set macros and set macro are legacy operators. There's also an unset macro operator. This lets you delete a macro, which might be useful sometimes if you want to ensure that your starting state is defined properly when you start a process. There's also There's also an operator called extract macro. This lets you create a macro based on something about the example set. Again, there's a video on that. So let's just very briefly let's look at the details of these. So generate macro. Look at the parameters here. I'm creating 4 macros here, and you can see I can have a great deal of flexibility here. I can actually use a macro and a string, and I can in fact use any of the functions available in here. And there is actually a video all about this, but the point is I'm creating a macro here. I'm also creating some other ones here, and there's a little known set of macros. These are reserved macros. This one is the system time, this one is the operator name, and this is the class of the operator. Let's just run to that point and see what happens in the macro view here. Back to the design view. So now, sure enough, there are some new macros have turned up. And you can see the system time, this is when I run it, it's 10 o'clock in the morning roughly. You can see that the operator name is generate macro. You can see that the class of the operator is this thing called macro construction operator. Happens to be where it's being executed. That's the reserved macro. And hello world again is a construction of hello world plus again. So it's a string. Okay, so that's pretty obvious what's going on here. Now let's move to the extract macro. Now in this situation I'm now extracting the value of example index 1 from attribute A1, and I'm basically putting the value of that into the macro called extracted macro. So if I run to that point, we will see, sure enough, there it is, extracted macro 5.1, which is, if I look at the example set, A1, there it is, 5.1, all good stuff. Let's continue. I'll clear that breakpoint. Provide macro as log value. That's a way of allowing you to record what value a macro has. In this case I'm putting it into the log, and the way to do that, you have to call this operator called provide macro as log value, and you give the name of the macro you want to provide, and then in a log operator here you simply put an entry in the log file with extracted macros, perhaps the name, and then you choose the name of the process, which is this one here. This is the name of the process where the macro value is being made available to you, and then you simply use the value option here, and you choose one of the things that the process, one of the things that the operator exposes, in this case the value of the macro. Sure enough, let's just break there, so have a look at the log. Here's the log, table view, there it is, extracted macro 5.1. So all we've essentially done is we've created a macro earlier on in the extract value, and then we've logged that. So we can look at that later in other ways. There is actually a video about that as well. So, okay, now let's clear these breakpoints. So now we'll look at some of the loop operators. This one's called loop attributes, and it contains operators in its own right. And what it will do is it will loop over all of the attributes that it's selected to do. I've chosen all. I've included the special attributes. And the key point about this, what's in this video, is that a macro gets created called loop underscore attribute, and each time an iteration occurs, this macro is set to, in this case, the attribute that's being considered. So if we go into the loop attribute operator, we will see I put a print to console here, and if I move this, we can see the text I'm going to log is attribute is followed by the name taken from the loop attribute macro, and I've also put a timestamp in here just to give us a nice warm feeling that it's happening in real time. Okay, so that's what will happen, and I'm also putting a delay in here, and I'm actually jumping ahead a bit, but I'm modifying how that behaves based on another macro, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But the point about this is this loop attribute operator will execute the same number of times as there are attributes. In this case there are 6 because it's the Irish data set, A1, A2, A3, A4, label and ID, and because I've chosen to include special attributes in my selection here, that's what we should see. So I'm going to set a breakpoint after it, and then we'll look at the log. You can actually see it executing here. I've put a delay of 3 seconds in so it happens more slowly so you can see it happening. And you can see here A1, A2, A3, A4 ID label, sure enough. So the process has finished, and this is just the results view, but here's the log. We saw that happening in real time. But let's just go over this. What you're seeing here, this is the first time the console log operator was called, and you can see that A1 is the value of the macro called loop attribute. Then it's A2, then it's A3, and so on. And ID and label are included. You can also see the timestamp when this was run, and you can see there's 3 seconds between them. It's deliberate just so it goes a bit more slowly so you can see it in real time. Don't normally need to do that. But if we go back to the design view, we can just make sure we understand. Now really this is where we're using macros to modify the behavior of operators, and there's a considerable amount of flexibility for this. But let's look at print to console again. So what you saw here, the value of the macro is being expanded and is being provided as the parameter to log value in this print to console. If I look at delay here, delay is an operator that just delays for a certain number of milliseconds. Well, in fact you can change it, but I'm saying delay for a fixed time called context macro delay, which is 3000 milliseconds, 3 seconds. So again, the behavior of the delay operator is being modified by the value of a macro. And generally, if an operator has free text here, you can generally type in a macro expansion to cause the modification to how the operator executes. So if I go up, now we'll look at these other loop operators which I've commented out. I'm not going to run that, I'll just go through them one by one. So loop is the generic loop, and you can set an iteration macro, and the number of times the iterations happen is dictated by the parameter here, say 10, whatever you wanted to type, and then this macro called iteration increments by 1 each time, and then obviously inside the loop operator you can use that. Loop files, similar idea. This time it just starts in a folder and looks for files, and there are various ways of controlling that with subdirectories and so on. But again, in this situation you get more files, so you get more macros created which you can use inside the loop. Loop examples, this basically loops down all of the examples in the example set one by one. So if there are 150 examples, it will execute 150 times the inner operators, and the macro in this situation is called example, so that gets created and incremented each time. Loop values, this is again, you choose an attribute, and the number of unique values that exist for that attribute are used to dictate how many times the loop goes off, and then there's a value put in the iteration macro here. Loop until, so again you can set a macro there. This will loop until a condition is true, and a macro is incremented each time until that true statement happens. Loop repository, so this actually lets you loop through, it's a bit like looping through files really, but in the repository, and there's a macro created called repository path, and entry name macro, repository path macro, and parent folder macro. There's just information to help you find the repository entry inside the loop. Loop collection, collections are collections of example sets, and you can iterate through them, and they're numbered, and the number you are at is what's recorded at the macro name parameter here, and that's passed to the inner operators. I won't run these, but we'll just they're there for completeness. Let's finally look at some other examples of using macros to change how operators work. So I've used set role here, and I've basically set the A1 attribute to take the target role based on what I've called context macro role. So here is the value of the macro. What I'm going to do therefore is change A1 from being a regular attribute to be a type my role. So if I set a breakpoint there, run it. Here we are, and you can see A1 has type my role. All very good. Generate attributes, that's a very typical use of macros. So you can see here me using the macro called reserved macro system time, and I'm putting that in quotes. So an attribute will be created called creatively new attribute, and it'll be set to whatever the macro reserved macro system time was set to. So again, set a breakpoint. Actually, I'm going to reduce this context macro delay down to 100 milliseconds, so it all goes a bit quicker. Okay, run it now. There we go, that was quicker. Sure enough, an attribute called new attribute has been created. It's set to the same value for all of them, all examples. And then finally, you can do this. You can change where you, for example, store something in the repository, and you can use the name. You can use the value of a macro to change the name of the thing you're creating. So I'm basically going to store my example set in the repository, and it's going to be called data with the value of the reserve macro system time macro appended to it. So let's run it all the way to the end. If I go back to the design view, you can see here, there it is, saved data. There it is. Yeah, my apologies. The full name is there. Saved data followed by this macro. So if I run that again, here it comes. Another one's turned up. Probably a bit quick for you there. There you go. So I run it again, and it is actually 10:18 in the morning, and sure enough, the name of this repository entry is now dictated by the value of a macro. Okay, so general rule about macros is they're very useful. They're used all the time, and the general guidance is if you have an operator, if you can type reasonably free text here or here, then a macro will be usable. Which means basically that most operators can have their operation modified by using a macro. So in summary then, let me change this back to 3000. I'll run it from beginning to end, and what we'll do, you can see in real time as the log happens here, you can see macros changing here. Okay, let's run that. I'll clear this. Here we go. You can see the loop attributes changing here, and you can see the log running in real time with a 3-second delay which I put in to make it show up. Okay.